My study is about the CFTA and how we can leverage it to address the issue of food insecurity on the continent. But in the study, you show that the numbers when it comes to food trade, food insecurity, they're a bit misleading, that the averages are a bit misleading. They don't give the actual picture of what's happening. So what's happening on the continent?
Yes, effectively, we try to make an argument in this report that the continental average is particularly misleading, I think, for Eastern Africa situation. So you commonly hear about food imports rising to over $100 billion for the continent, which is correct, but is not the net position in terms of factoring in how much agricultural exports the continent does to the rest of the world as well. So the net figure actually improved quite markedly in 2023, and now the deficit we calculate for the continent is around $22 billion. So it's a much lower figure than people commonly cite when they talk about this thing. Now, with Channing we were just having a conversation about how continental aggregates can be very misleading about the share of intra-regional trade in total trade for the continent. And I think this applies equally to the food trade as well. Yeah. So the food deficits on the continent are driven basically by 4 or 5 large economies which are responsible for 80–90% of the food import bill for the continent, particularly the Northern African countries, Nigeria, Angola. These countries have very large food trade deficits. But the average for Eastern Africa, the majority of countries, yes, there are some problems in some particular cases, but they're not so large that it's insurmountable.
Yeah, okay. And I think the whole issue is the way the figures are presented for Africa as averages, instead of looking at the individual countries. Maybe Channing can say also something about the numbers, what does the numbers show when it comes to food trade, food security on the continent?
As Andrew was saying, the effect of Northern Africa is quite large. That Egypt, Algeria are big traders. Morocco is a big importer as well. So for sub-Saharan Africa, you're seeing, as Andrew was saying, a much lower. Pretty much. I think in maize, the most recent figures that I saw were net trade positive, and so Africa is in that way keeping up with demand. It is a matter, and this is part of the trade issue of you're going to have in agriculture areas of production and areas of consumption, right? And so and then food has to move. It's produced in the rural area and typically in favorable areas, right, for growing, and then it's going to move to the big cities because now Africa is right around 50% urban, right? And so trade is super important in the sense that agriculture has always been a risky business. There's, that the production bounces up and down, but it doesn't do so uniformly across the continent or even across regions. It goes up and down, in a variable way, and trade is the way to, balance these inevitable changes in production across the regions, and that's a way to augment food security. And so this, I think, the Continental Free Trade Area has real potential to make sure that you have the growing areas, you have the population concentrations. There's nothing that says that one population concentration has always to be served by one growing area. If it can be served by multiple, it's got a portfolio of areas to be served from, and it'll be more stable and lower price.
Well, these were actually arguments that were made some 30 years ago by Professor John Weeks, and he makes that case for Southern Africa. And he shows very clearly that effectively, because of different seasons, for example, even within Southern Africa, there was a tremendous scope for greater trade there. So if it was true 30 years ago, it's doubly true today.
Especially when we are having issues of climate change and all those challenges. So the CFTA is a real answer to our food security issue.
I think it's not the only answer. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done to actually make the AfCFTA effective. But there is a lot of scope for intra-regional trade between the blocks. Okay, so within East Africa Community, we've eliminated the tariff barriers practically, but the problem is the non-tariff barriers within. But the East Africa community as a bloc is quite protectionist towards imports from outside. And so that is an issue which the AfCFTA is perfectly designed to tackle. So we have more intra-regional trade between the sub-regional blocs. Yeah.